Good, Yantif. Tomorrow morning, we will read one of the most powerful passages in the Torah here on this bima, Moses' final speech to the Israelites before he dies and before they cross the Jordan River. He takes this opportunity to remind them of who they are, a people who stood at Sinai and bound themselves to one another, and also who they are called to be, eternally connected, whether they were together at that moment or not, bound together by history and a joint commitment to a covenant, a way of life that is unique to them and that also has something to say about the entire world. He says famously, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. You stand here this day, all of you, before the eternal your God. And he goes on to list your tribal heads, your elders, your officials, the entire body of Israel, your children and wives, even the stranger within your camp, from the wood chopper to the water drawer, to enter into the covenant with God, which the eternal your God promised you, as sworn to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I make this covenant not with you alone, but with those who are standing here today before the eternal our God, and with those who are not here with us this day. The covenant Moses invokes in this moment is all the more astonishing and powerful because taking on this commitment was actually our first act as a free people. Our rabbis teach that slavery is both a physical reality and a state of mind, and that when the Israelites left Egypt, even though they were physically free, they perceived themselves to be enslaved still. But when Israel gathered at Mount Sinai, binding ourselves to God, to the Torah, and to a set of obligations and a set of values, we were expressing true freedom for the first time. It was our first collective action, not based primarily on our victimhood, but rather in a sense of collective strength and collective mission. During the course of this intensely difficult year of living Jewishly in America that we have all had, the virulent hostility of much of the outside world toward Israel and often toward Jews and Judaism in general, along with the strife within our own friend groups and our own family circles around October 7th and its aftermath, has made it hard to express a confident Jewish voice, even to hear ourselves think it's been hard sometimes, almost anywhere. The world has felt destabilized, and we on such tentative ground with our own identities that showing up as fully ourselves often felt out of reach. As an example of this, I will share with you that people here at Turo, from our congregants with Israeli loved ones and friends who have been daily touched by this conflict and by the massacre of October 7th, all the way to congregants most critical of Israel and concerned for the Palestinian people, both of these groups have felt alienated from others in our community, which is to say to me that perhaps many, if not all of us, are feeling it sometimes. Not having access to one's own voice, being coerced into litmus tests, or forced to hide parts of ourselves to be safe, if not physically, then at least psychologically, has been painful and confusing and undermining a sort of victim or slave mentality, and it must stop. It is time to cross over to a more emancipated expression of our Judaism. In the midst of this high holiday season, a year after October 7th, because our young people are watching and striving to learn what it means to be a committed and principled member of the Jewish community, and because the stakes of our collective Jewish future are so high, it is time to claim our strength that comes from knowing who we are and knowing who we are called to be. Just like our ancient ancestors at Sinai, it is time to reject our victimhood and embrace self-possession. The entire world is talking about us, about Judaism, about Israel, about Zionism, and about the very essence of Jewishness itself. But the most important conversation amidst all of that noise is the one that we have amongst ourselves about these values and the ways that we choose to live together. So that is the teaching that I would like to begin tonight, not about the war and not about the politics, but about us. Talking about our Jewish experiences in this moment and the Jewish values that animate us might make us want to look for the door to the synagogue, which I told you where those were about an hour ago, or the door to community, God forbid, and it might make us prefer to leave the conversation behind for others to have instead. But we can't. We can't. This conversation needs all of us. I assure you that tonight's message is for all of us, no matter whether we find ourselves on the left or on the right or somewhere in between. The discomfort will be equally felt by all, so for that, you're welcome. But the first thing I want to teach is that we don't have to be so afraid of each other. It is not beyond us to reclaim our voice on behalf of our people and all people, not because they out there are making us, but because we choose it. We can do this, and we must. As Moses says to the people in the passage that we will read on this bima tomorrow, "Ki hamitzvah hazot asher anochi mitzavcha hayom, lo nifleti mincha velo rechoka hi, karov elecha hadavar me'od, beficha ubelvavcha la'asoto." The instruction which I enjoin upon you this day, it's not too baffling for you. It is not too hard for you. It is not beyond your reach. The thing is very close to you, in your mouths and in your hearts, that you can do it. We can do it. Firstly, to be in deep conversation, it is important to be clear about and to correct misrepresentations of our history and our identity and our own sacred story. Jews, the people of Israel, as we are called throughout the Torah and all subsequent texts, are descendants of an ancient tribe originating in the land of Israel and who came to be dispersed throughout the world, mostly through violent expulsions and fleeing of oppressive environments, but also through natural human migratory patterns. Our presence in Europe is the result of being brought there as slaves by the Romans after the Second Temple was destroyed in the 1st century CE, or due to economically driven population movement within the ancient and medieval empires that governed large swaths of the lands where we lived, such as the Moors who ruled Spain and North Africa as early as the 700s. Central and Eastern European, Ashkenazi, Jewish population centers emerged largely because of expulsions from other places in Europe, especially after Jews were blamed for the Black Plague in the 14th century and expulsions from Spain and Portugal in the 15th. Ironically, Poland was a particularly tolerant place for Jews for several centuries before it assumed a different style. Our continuous Jewish presence in the Middle East, with major population centers in Iran, ancient Persia, and in Iraq, ancient Babylonia, and in Egypt and Morocco and Ethiopia and Yemen and Afghanistan, among others, is a result of those exiles from our homeland and groups managing to find stable, nearby communities in which to thrive, often enjoying warm relations with other groups in those lands, Arabs and Muslims in particular. Some Middle Eastern Jewish communities are over 2,500 years old. That is how long we have inhabited that part of the world. And it is also important to remember that in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East and every other place that we have lived over the course of millennia, we have maintained our connection to our original home in the land of Israel, also called Palestine by ancient Greek and Jewish historians, and of course later by the Romans, directing our prayers toward Jerusalem, celebrating our holidays according to the weather patterns and harvest times in that land, preserving our Hebrew language in the sacred texts, and longing for and often sometimes actualizing physical return. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the ongoing ingathering of Ashkenazi and Sephardi and Ethiopian and Russian and Mizrahi and Middle Eastern and North African Jews was and is a homecoming and a re-indigenization of our people in its ancient homeland. I encourage everyone to learn more through the courses that we will offer later this year. And of course, there are amazing books on Jewish history and population movements, but I shared this mini and surely a bit sloppy crash course in Jewish history for two reasons. The first is to emphasize that our sense of peoplehood, despite our geographic and cultural diversity, and despite numerous attempts by numerous empires to wipe us out of existence, this is a remarkable dimension of our Jewish identity, this connection that we have amongst ourselves across the world. And the second reason I share it as I begin tonight is to suggest that we American Jews have a tendency to project our particular experience of the last 150 years onto the rest of the Jewish world, masking the truth of global Jewish existence. Jewish life on these shores has been marked by remarkable safety and acceptance and economic and political power, and in this, we must remember we are the exception and not the rule. Because of our exceptional experience as American Jews, we have been able to use our power and our access to power on behalf of other groups to fight for justice in the public square on the basis of our Jewish teachings. This is a phenomenal gift to the world, and it is a privilege of being an American Jew. It is something that other Jews around the world should learn from and be inspired by, but we must also be humble about it. Most other Jews across time and space have lived with profound precarity. Violence, expulsion, and mass migration are common occurrences in their stories, even until today in some places, and their limited power could only ever be used to sustain their own survival. This divergence in our sense of vulnerability with the rest of the Jewish world has an impact on how we speak to and understand one another across the ocean, and it has been weaponized by those who would wish us harm. This year has brought frequent attempts to undermine Jewish history, to undermine Jewish connection to the land of Israel, and to undermine our Jewish story. It would be a betrayal of who we are to allow that to stand as we encounter it, even among friends and allies. And cherishing our own history and memory demands of us that we acknowledge this right in and for other people as well. Our histories and memories, even other histories and memories, even if they make us uncomfortable, they can also be true. The land of Israel did not sit entirely empty after the end of Jewish sovereignty there 2,000 years ago. We are not the only people to belong to it and to call it home for centuries. The Palestinian people are also of that land. Even the ancient texts that we all hold dear indicate a consistent presence of other nomadic and agricultural tribes in the region, even some of them related by blood to our people. It is unbecoming and unnecessary to undermine Palestinian identity by splitting hairs about when they came to call themselves Palestinians or when Palestinian identity became a national movement. It needn't undermine our connection to our ancient homeland to admit that they too have such a connection to their homeland. The truth about mass Jewish migration to the land of Israel over the last century, that it was a return rather than a colonization, and that it was a movement of refugees toward a safe haven. This does not become less true when we acknowledge that our independence and our national rebirth in Israel was also a Nakba, a catastrophe for the Palestinians who were living there. Even if we are not always paid the same respect by other groups, we ought to extend that respect because that is who we are called to be. Despite the pressures in our current culture to trap ourselves in binary thinking, holding multiple truths is within our capacity to do, and in fact, it is part of our inheritance as Jews. In the Talmud, an argument recorded between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, two highly respected first-century ancient centers of learning, and these scholars, actually we have records of hundreds of their arguments, but amidst their arguments, we learned that this is what happened in the Talmud. Yatsa bat kol ve'amra elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. The divine voice interrupted their arguing and said, "These and these are words of the living God." Acknowledging multiple truths, even when they are competing and even when they are contradictory, does not diminish our moral claims. In fact, it heightens them because it models integrity and confidence in who we are. Rejecting the binary and embracing multiple truths is one of our Jewish values. And on a practical level, it is virtually impossible to engage productively in any conversation about Israel and Palestine if we do not hone this skill. Because the history of this conflict and these two peoples and the current situation that they find themselves in at almost every inflection point is full of cognitive dissonance, I promise you, we can cross over to a place where this kind of complex thinking is possible. It is in our mouths, it is in our hearts that we can do it. Another of our most cherished Jewish values is empathy. That means putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and understanding the feelings of another because we are able to extrapolate learnings from our own painful experiences. You shall not oppress the stranger, for you know the stranger, the feeling of the strangers, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. This commandment, as we have spoken about before, repeated 36 times in our Torah, calls upon us to remember our own pain and our own oppression, not only to tell our story, but so that we can monitor our behavior toward others. And especially, it acknowledges that we must do that when power dynamics in the world change. This sounds easy, but it is actually very, very difficult because some pain is traumatic. Some pain is even epigenetic, meaning stored in our bodies and passed down through our genes. And that kind of pain doesn't always soften us and fill us with empathy. Sometimes that kind of pain makes us understandably closed off and suspicious and highly reactive, even trapping us in a victim-slave mentality long after we have regained our agency in practice. Some Jews amongst us in America have been so frustrated for so long with the ongoing Israeli occupation in the West Bank and the general stagnation of any sort of peace process since the crumbling of Oslo, particularly younger Jews who did not live through the horrors of the Second Intifada. They don't have that stored in their memory, in their bones, like many of us do, or who cannot recall the optimism of the peace process before that a generation ago. Some of those individuals, some of us, were not able to summon the appropriate amount of empathy for Israeli victims of the Hamas massacre on October 7th. We're not able to summon even a modicum of empathy for the hostages, or for Israeli society in general, who had a war forced upon them on October 7th. A war that they had been trying not to wage in full for decades because they knew what going into Gaza to fight Hamas would mean for IDF soldiers, their children, and for Gazan civilians. Israel had built security barriers and bomb shelters in every home and an Iron Dome system of defense, and withstood years of constant and indiscriminate rocket fire in many of its southern towns and villages from Hamas and in the north from Hezbollah to avoid the war that October 7th ultimately made unavoidable. And at the same time, after October 7th, when Israelis had been so brutalized and traumatized by the massacres and the butchery, and the rape and the kidnapping that day, many Jews in Israel and around the world, and many among us, were not able to find space in our sphere of concern for Palestinians who would be in the crossfires of that inevitable war. And day after day, and month after month, as we learn more and more about the devastation in Gaza and the massive loss of life, it is still hard for some in our community to grapple with this reality. Legitimate concerns we might have about the war aims or the manner of its prosecution or the motivations of the Prime Minister to continue to wage it, along with a simple and deep grief at the ugliness of war. Many of those concerns have been silenced within us. We have silenced ourselves because our own immense fear and rage and pain took up all our emotional capacities. Both of these reactions within our community, a lack of empathy for Palestinian civilians in Gaza caught in a war zone that none of them wanted either, and a lack of empathy for Israeli victims of Hamas terror and the general untenable reality with which so many Israelis and Palestinians live every day. Both of these reactions are also instances of us falling short of living up to our value of empathy. This new year invites each of us, in our own way, privately, to name our shortcomings. Name them to ourselves, not because of external criticism, some legitimate and some completely illegitimate, but because empathy is our religious value, it's ours. We name it and lift it up because that is what our tradition calls us to do. As John Poland, father of Hirsch, said in his speech at the DNC in August, there is a surplus of tragedy on all sides. In a competition of pain, there are no winners. Amen. I promise you, we can cross over to a place where this kind of complex feeling is possible. It is in our mouths. It is in our hearts. We can do it. There is a beautiful midrash that I've kept close this year, a midrash that presents an image that has helped me to articulate to myself another key Jewish value, and I have begun to identify it also as what I believe our congregational ethos to be. In a 7th century collection of rabbinic legends and commentaries on the Torah, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which emerged from the Talmudic yeshivot of Israel and Babylonia, it is written, Rabbi Eliezer said, on the day when God said, let the waters be gathered together at the creation of the world, on that very day were the waters of the Red Sea congealed, and they were made into 12 valleys, corresponding to the 12 tribes, and they were made into walls of water between each path, and the people walking through them could see each other, and they also saw God, the Holy One, walking before them, but unable to fully discern God's footsteps. As the psalm says, your way was in the sea, and your paths in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. This image is that of a primordial emergence of different paths to cross the Red Sea, a hallway for each tribe of Israel, leading to the same wilderness, that place of spiritual and cultural formation for our people. Each one is distinct, these hallways, but each one has a window in it that allows that tribe to see what the other hallways are like, what the people in the hallways are doing, windows that remind each set of travelers that those on the other hallways are on this collective journey with them and are striving to follow in God's sometimes inscrutable footsteps too. I love this midrash because it suggests the holiness of Jewish pluralism, lifting up the beauty of diversity in our Jewish community within our people. It offers a vision of a way of being, a way of living that makes space for many different Jewish identities and orientations and questions when it comes to pursuing a Jewish life and lifestyle, space for all of the tribes. There are boundaries in this midrash, and there are boundaries in our community. The paths all lead to a place of emancipated, vibrant Jewish existence that is full of tradition and heritage and a commitment to the survival of our entire people. Those who disregard the safety and the future of any of the tribes even those they disagree with and whose ways they do not understand. Those who disregard the safety and the future of any of the tribes cannot be a part of this story. But beyond that, this midrash includes everyone. The image reminds us that we don't have to demand complete uniformity to travel together. If we share a common vision for an authentic and full and free Jewish existence, a commitment to pursuing that vision with a sense of individual agency and self-respect for ourselves and for others, and also a sense of responsibility to a broader collective, a committed and generous pluralism, then we can travel together. It can be scary to build diverse, pluralistic community. And there have been many times in the past year, and I feel certain there will be times in the next year, when it hurts just a little too much, when we are too raw, when we really just need to cocoon within our own hallways with those whose paths completely overlap with ours. And that is all right. Of course it's all right. We just cannot stay there forever because we will never truly move forward. We must make sure that our eyes are open enough to glimpse those windows that show us other ways of being. This alienation from each other is destroying us. It is eating away at the very core of our identity, the very essence of our strength, which is our communal solidarity. It is from that place of communal solidarity that we have learned to have the power to sustain our people and to do the work of tikkun olam that is so important to so many of us. I promise you, we can cross over to a place where this kind of complex and passionate living together is also possible. And as your rabbi, I promise to partner with you to make this a reality. In closing, I repeat to all of us what Moses says to the people on the threshold of their next chapter, which is, as I shared with our Torah study just last week when we read it, perhaps my favorite verse in the entire Torah. Ki ha-mitzvah azot asher anochi mitzavcha hayom lo nifleti mimcha velo rechokahi, ki karov elecha hadavar me'od, beficha uvilvavcha la'asoto. This teaching, which we collectively commit to this day, it is not too difficult for us. It is not beyond our reach. It cannot be beyond our reach. No, this is very close to us. It is our very essence. It is the essence of who we are as a Jewish community. It is in our mouths. It is in our hearts that we can think it and that we can feel it and that we can live it. We are standing here, anachnu nitzavim, and it is time. So let us cross over together. Gamar Tov and Shabbat Shalom.